Hello, and welcome to this video. We're going to discuss non-looping conditional statements. And non-looping conditional statements are important because they allow us to better control our program, which means that instead of running our programs where every single line of code is going to execute, non-looping conditional statements allow us to change the way a program runs where some code will not be executed. It will be skipped when the program runs. And conditional statements only run as long as the condition or Boolean expression or compound Boolean expression is true. So you can think of it as you're asking a question. If the question's answer is true, the code will run. Otherwise, it will be skipped. And we've got two versions of conditional statements. You have the non-looping conditionals. So the code attached to this conditional will only run just one time when the condition is true. And then you have looping conditionals, where the code attached to that conditional will continue to run, possibly multiple times, as long as the condition is true. And we'll get to that a little bit later on. So today we're going to focus on these non-looping conditionals. The idea, you think of it as you're asking a question of the code as it's running, and if the answer to the question is true, then you're going to run this code. If the answer to the question is false, you'll skip it and you'll move on to the next thing that you're going to evaluate. So, what do these statements look like as we are writing them? And they're going to simply start with if, both all lowercase I, lowercase f, a parenthesis, and the parenthesis is required, then you're going to have your condition, which is just a short name for a Boolean expression, and then another parenthesis. And then you've got two options. If you have one line of code to run when true, then you just write that one line of code with your semicolon at the end. You could also, let's say there's multiple lines of code that you want to run when that condition is true. You must use curly braces. And you should always label an ending curly brace to tell you what that is ending. So in this case, it's ending the if statement. And so this, I'm going to do when there are one or multiple lines to run when true. So you could always just use curly braces to be on the safe side. But anytime that you want to run multiple lines when something is true, you must use curly braces. And that way it attaches everything that's inside of those curly braces to that if statement. And this is real simple and easy if you think about it. Or you do things like this all the time. So let's say that I have an int x and it equals 10. And I want to say something like if x is greater than 5, then I'm going to output x is greater than 5. So it's asking this question. If this condition is true, this line of code will output. If this condition is not true, the line of code will not output. So I could do another if statement. If x mod 2 equals 1, which is checking if x is an odd number. Then I could say print line x is odd. Isn't that print line? The next closest even numbers are x plus 1 and x minus 1. So in this case, I've got two different lines that I want to run when that condition is true. Again, here, as long as this condition, this is what's checking. If this is true, it'll run what's inside of those curly braces. If it's not true, it's going to run, it'll skip it. So if we take a look, I'm going to take this code, go into Eclipse. I'm going to create a new Java class, name it ifs practice. I want to make sure that I have a main method and hit finish. There's my new file. Make sure you put your name kind of at the top. I'm going to delete that, move this down a little bit so I know that this is the end of main. All code goes before this. And this is the end of my class. And I'm going to take that code that I wrote. X equals 10 if x is greater than 5, x is greater than 5. And my second condition, and just so that I know that my code has finished running, I'm going to add in a little statement. So I know I've reached the end of my program. I'm going to save it. I want to go through and run it. Make my console a little bigger down here. So notice it says x is greater than 5, then end of program. So because x was odd, it totally skipped this statement. And what's neat is that you can look at this and let's say I come up here and I make x equal to 3. So it's odd, but it's not greater than 5. If I run this again, notice I go x is odd, the next closest even numbers are 4 and 2. It's important that you put this inside of parentheses if you actually want to add to that value. If this was not inside of parentheses, take a look, you're going to see a different output. The next closest even numbers are 31 and 2. And that's because in this case, it doesn't add them together, it just outputs them next to each other. So you want to make sure if you're ever doing actual math inside of a print statement, that you put that math inside of parentheses and make sure it outputs correctly. And then let's say that I change this to 13, so it's greater than 5 and it's odd. I get both of those conditional statements print out. Now, what you want to do sometimes, though, is you're going to want to say, okay, I have two options. Either this is true, and if this isn't true, I want to do something else. And what we do is we call that an if-else statement. So if I take my two if statements that I had before, and let's say that they each had a second possible option. So if this condition was true, I was going to do this. If it's not true, then I have something that I want to do as well. So what I can do is I can connect it and say else, and I can say one line of code to run when condition above was false. Or I can put an else statement here, and if I had multiple things that I wanted to run when that condition is false, I can say, I can put that also inside of curly braces. And you can combine or not combine these curly braces however you want. So if the if statement has one line and the else statement has multiple lines, this could have one line and this could have curly braces after it. So think of this as kind of like, some good examples of this are when you're flipping a coin, because you have the options of heads or tails, and there's no other possible option. Or evens, or even or odd numbers. There's only two possible options. So if, else. Either it's heads or it's tails. Either it's even or it's odd. So it's just kind of an example of when you might have these type of statements. There's tons and tons of other options. There's tons and tons of other times that you might use them as you're going through things. If we wanted to take a look at some actual code and add that in here. So if x is less than 5, the opposite of that statement, if that statement was false, then you would say, okay, well, x is either less than or equal to 5. So it's not bigger, it's got to be the same or smaller. Or, if x is not odd, then it must be even. And then the next closest odd numbers would be x plus 1 or x minus 1. And I can save that and run it. And so my number was 13. My output didn't change at all from before, because I didn't change my if statements. But if I put in something like 10, like I had at the beginning, remember when we ran it the first time, we only got this output statement. I should get that output statement and these two, because x is now even. So I get x is greater than 5, x is even, the next closest odd numbers are 11 and 9. And same thing if I try this and I put 3 in, and I take a look at what I'm going to get. I get that x is less than or equal to 5, and then it's odd, and the next closest even numbers are 4 and 2. So if-else statements are great whenever you have two possible options. You cannot have an else by itself, and it must come directly after the if statement. You can't add in an extra line if, let's say, for some reason I outputted just the word hello or something. Notice that this has a red squiggly line underneath of it. Remember, we told that means that it's error, that there's an error there, and your code will not run. And it says syntax error on token else, delete this token. So what it's saying is that else isn't attached to anything. It doesn't know what it's connected to. So there's two ways to fix that. Either get rid of the extra line of code. As soon as I get rid of that, my error goes away. Or if I wanted to do those two things, then I have to put them inside of a set of curly braces. So now I've connected all of this with the if statement, and I can connect this else with the if right above it. Sometimes, though, you're going to have multiple options, and you want to go through and process a few different options, not just one option or not just two options. And what we can do is we can combine a whole bunch of else statements with additional if statements. So let's say that I have an int x equals 10, and I have another int y that equals 15. And I want to go through and say something like if x mod 2 equals 0, which means that x is even, and y mod 2 equals 0, so both numbers even, then I can print both even. But there's other options, right? One of them, they could both be odd, so then I would need to say else if x mod 2 equals 1 and y mod 2 equals 1. So they're both odd. And then I have a third option. If they're not both even, they're not both odd, then one of them must be even and one must be odd. So I've linked and I've put an extra, I've put an else in right here. It's connected to that if, but I've added an extra condition. And you can put as many of these else ifs between an if and an else as you want. So if there were lots of different options, you could put more and more else ifs in the middle. So if we take a look here, I go back into my code. Now I'm going to print just a blank line so I can kind of see the difference between the first set of code and the second set of code. And notice that right here, it's got a problem with x. And that's because I already created x up here. I can't recreate it down here. I can take x and give it a new value and say, hey, I want x equal to 10 now, but I can't recreate it. So if x is 10 and y is 15, I go through and run my code. Notice it tells me I have one even number and one odd number. And you always want to kind of check all possible cases to make sure that you didn't mess something up. So there's an option where they're both even. I can come in and make them both 1. It tells me that they're both odd. So I've checked that all three of these options popped up at some point with given the correct x value and the correct y value. And like I said, I might want to go through and figure out what, or get a value, I should say, that might have multiple options, more than just 3. So what I'm doing here is a few things. This code right here, when I say double x, remember that's casting x's temporarily casted as a double. So it's acting like a double. So let's say y is 100 and x is 79. So I'm trying to figure out like my grade. What grade percentage would I get? So there's options, right? I could have an A, a B, a C, a D, or an E. And this is where you also want to think about when you're going through and making up your if statements. Always start with the most specific. What's the most specific option? You kind of start at one end or the other. You don't want to start in the middle and figure out what a C is. So if my grade is greater than 0.894, then they got an A. Else, if their grade is greater than 0.794, then I know that they got a B. And I don't have to worry about putting in and grade is less than or equal to 0.894, because it's not possible. If it is greater than 0.894, then it gets picked up above. And then I can just keep going through and say else if grade is greater than 0.694, then you got a C. Else if grade is greater than 0.594, you got a D. And then else, if they didn't get an A, a B, a C, or D, or an E, or an A, a B, a C, or a D, then they got an E. So I can just leave this as an else. You don't always have to end with an else. If I wanted to, I could say if grade is greater than 0, greater than or equal to 0, you got an E, and end it that way. But there's really no need to do that because I know it's my last case. So this if grade is greater than 0 is really not necessary. I'm going to take a look at it. I run it. I got a C. And I can come up here and you would want to test and make sure that you've tested for all the cases. So I want to test and make sure it works when I got an A. I want to come in and test an 85. Make sure I got a B. That works. You also want to try and test the cases that are right on the bubble. So 59 is an E, whereas if I have a 59, if I had a higher value, like 59.5 somehow, I would want to make sure that that came up as a D. So here, let's try 60, since my X is an int. I can't make it a decimal. There you go. I got a D. So now I've tested all of those cases. And if I take out these comments, and I left that grade greater than 0, still it's going to get a D there. If I change it to 59, I got an E. So it's unnecessary. The if statement right there is not necessary if you know the only possible other condition is that else. But if there was, let's say, a condition you're not going to check for, then you would make sure that that was an if statement, an else if statement that checks that additional condition. Okay, a few other things that you need to know about if statements, else if statements as they go through. And some kind of general rules. You always start with an if statement, with an if, and then some condition. You can have as many else ifs connected as you want. You can only have one else per if statement. So you can't just kind of have an else hanging out in the middle of your code somewhere. If you only want to run one line of code for the if, else if, or else, you do not need curly braces. If you are running multiple lines of code for the if, else if, else, you must use curly braces. And if you're using just one line of code, you can always put those curly braces in there as well. Something that you should be aware of as you're going through this. Else statements are connected to the closest possible if. Indentation does not matter. So if you look back at the code in here, you'll notice that every time I went inside of an if, it indented. And Eclipse will actually do that for you. As soon as I hit enter, it automatically indents that statement. Okay? The indentation is just for ease of reading code. It has no function in Java. I want to make sure that I put something there. If I don't put something in here, whatever it finds as the next line of code, it's going to attach to that Y. Even though it's not indented, even though it's way down here, it looks like it shouldn't be connected, it's going to connect this end of program print statement with the Y is less than 10. Notice that it didn't output down here because my Y was 100. You want to make sure that when you're using just one line of code, it's whatever the next line of code is that it's going to attach to that if statement. So now I get my end of program back because this isn't attached to that if statement. Similarly, let's say I have an else statement down here. I can't have that else statement by itself. You also, let's say I throw in another if statement in here. It's possible that I'm going to get multiple outputs here. If you wanted all three of these to be connected, or you wanted this line of code to only run when this was false, you need to make sure that those are right next to each other. So let's take a look. Right now, we know my Y is 100. So it only outputs Y is greater than or equal to 10. But if I come up here, or right here, and I just say, hey, Y, I want you to equal 0. I get Y is less than 10, Y is 0. If I outputted, if my value was, let's say, 1,000, or no, let's go with, okay, let's go with 5. Notice that I get Y is less than 10, Y is greater than or equal to 10. And that's not true. This else statement is going to be connected to the closest if, which means it's connected to that if statement. Even if I wanted to say, hey, if Y is less than 10, I want to check if Y is 0, and I indent this. Not going to change what happens in my code. Indentation in Java is just to make it pretty and to make it much, much easier to read. You should always, always, always indent. One tab space after or within an if, an else if, or an else. And Eclipse will automatically do this for you. Some programming languages, indentation matters. So you don't need the curly braces, you would just indent everything, and that connects it kind of to the thing above it. Java is not that way. Java, you need to make sure that you indent just for looks. And if you're going to have multiple lines or something, that you use those curly braces, or you know exactly what you're attaching to each of those statements. Now to take it one step further, there's a thing called nesting. And this is when you put one item inside of another, so you can have what are called nested if statements. So if we take a look at our example from a minute ago, I said if Y is less than 10, I wanted to output something. Now if I wanted to check before I output that, if y equals 0, because 0 is less than 10, I can put that inside of there. So it's only going to check this condition if y is less than 10. Then it does an additional check. Is y equal to 0? And then I can put an else here that just tells me that y is less than 10. And I can end this. And then I could put my else here that says y is greater than or equal to 10. So right here I have an if-else that is nested inside of this if statement. And this code here will only run if this is true. So if we take a look here, at my code and see if it runs differently than the code right above it, which it should. Put a line in here. So here I've got my nested statements. So I can clearly see the difference when I run them. Here's what I get for the first set of if-else statements right there, and then here's what I get for the nested if statements. So it doesn't give me incorrect information. It connects now, this else statement is now connected to this if statement. So if you take a look at it there, I'm looking at, here's my code. Ooh. And what is connected to what? This else is connected to that if statement. Whereas here, this else is connected to that if statement. It's closest since inside the curly braces. This else is connected to this if statement. Because it ignores everything that's inside of these curly braces, because that's all connected to the if statement itself. So you want to be very careful when you're going through that. Make sure when you're going through especially the worksheets that you pay close attention to that. And one of the biggest, most common errors, and I have students that are in CP3, students that have been programming forever, is that they put an extra semicolon after the condition. So what do I mean? They do something like this. If y is less than 10, and they put a semicolon here. This semicolon, you're going to see, causes a major, major problem. And you're going to be like, my code's not working. It's always doing something, and it shouldn't be doing something. So this extra semicolon here is bad. So if you take a look, and I come up and I do something with my code, and say I put a semicolon there, I'm always going to get this code outputted now. Even if I make y 50. It says y is less than 10, y is greater than or equal to 10. If I make y 0, y is less than 10, y is 0. This semicolon disconnects this statement. And therefore this code is always going to be run. So when you do something like that, that code is always going to output y is less than 10 because of that semicolon. And it's probably one of the most common errors, and it's going to be a silly error, and it is not an error that will come up and Java will tell you automatically. It's what we call a programmer's error, or a logic error. So you want to be very careful as you're going through that. There are additional notes written up and posted on Google Classroom. You always have the interns if you have any questions. Good luck.